Hello, everyone, and hello, Wendy.
Hi.
It's really good to see you all. Thank you to Anthony for the introductions. As Anthony has said, my name is Jana, and I will be hosting this discussion. Wendy, it's a real pleasure, and as much as it may sound like a cliche, it is also an honor to be talking to you, especially given the context of your most recent book. So I'm delighted that you're joining us today, and I'm delighted that
Sorry, let me just thank both you and Anthony for having me and for having done the work with the book. Thank you.
I was going to say I'm in particular delighted because the topic of the book actually concerns something that crosses not only a perennial topic in social theory, which is what is the meaning of anything, but also something that speaks very directly, I think, to the current predicament, whatever that may be. But I'm in particular happy that and I think this is something that you do with the book really well, that you expand beyond that into questions of, well, what can any kind of social diagnostic actually tell us, not only about the present times, but more importantly, what and how we should relate to those times. So let me get started with what I think, well, first was certainly my first question when reading the book or when receiving the book happily from the publisher. And I think will probably be the question that's in some ways something that a lot of our audience today and hopefully future readers of the book will ask themselves, which is, why Max Weber? So why start thinking about nihilism with Max Weber?
I can only answer that question somewhat indirectly. Weber is by no means the most profound theorist of nihilism. He would not even have considered himself a theorist of nihilism. As we know, not only is there a great 19th century tradition in German thought and also in Russian literature turning into the 20th century, and then more recently, quite a significant philosophical excavation and exploration of nihilism, far more profound than Weber's. But what has drawn me to work on these two texts, his lecture on science and his lecture on politics, both of them given very late in his life, toward the end of World War I. What has drawn me to work on them is precisely that he is bringing the problem to two domains that many of us care about deeply, namely the domain of the academy or knowledge, science, Wissenschaft, and on the other hand, the domain of politics. And for Weber, these two domains, which happen to be his twin loves, as he confessed, he believed deeply in the worth and the value of both. For Weber, these twin loves are also arch opposites. Now, I do not subscribe to the idea that they are arch opposites, but I have long been drawn to his exploration of the nihilistic corrosions, erosions, and predicaments in both the academy and the domain of politics that are refracted through these two lectures, but also through his understanding of these as opposites that increasingly are incurring upon one another, invading one another with their demands, especially in the direction of the political domain invading the knowledge domain. Now, for Weber, I'll just add this. It's important to see the time and the context of the lectures as one that was not only a crisis, namely World War I, at that time thought of as really the greatest crisis that Europe had ever been through, and implicating the rest of the world in it. But it was also a time of enormous tumult or fervor, and we need to remember this, that not only is it right in the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, but it is also a time of revolutionary fervency in Germany. And Weber's speaking to that, speaking to it as he is speaking to students who invited him to give these lectures, many of whom are caught up in this revolutionary sentiment. So all of that is background, but to now just zero in on your question and conclude, what I think Weber offers is a profound, if incomplete and insufficient and problematic diagnostic of the ways that nihilism is producing a particular set of conditions in both the academy and politics. And just very briefly, in the academy, I think for Weber, the problem of boundary breakdown, narcissism, cult of personality, expectation that knowledge and the classroom in particular will offer a complete worldview and a politics. Those are all he takes. He takes all of those as nihilistic effects in the academy. And then in politics, something parallel, namely cult of personality, revolutionary fervor that is not necessarily responsible, also right-wing nationalist fervor that is not necessarily responsible, all kinds of breakdowns of accountability, what we would call today the truth or the facticity problem in politics, mirrors, even if it is different from the ones that he finds in the academy. So my aim is to read Weber to read these lectures of Weber's through the framework of nihilism, not to read them finally and truly to give a definitive account of the lectures, but simply to think about them through that particular interpretive frame and to see what light Weber can help shed on our own predicaments without taking him, as it were, at his word or through his arch oppositions and distinctions.
That's great. And you've, in a manner of speaking, covered a lot of the things that I am going to raise or hoping to raise in this discussion. But let's start from the beginning. I think I told you this when we had a brief chat before the conversation itself, which is that in the introduction, you say that you're not a Weber scholar, or that your approach to this these two lectures in this particular context or in this particular volume is not one of a Weber scholar. But as I said at that point, I would probably beg to disagree in the sense in which I think you actually offer a very good, deep and critical reading, but also you've engaged with Weber as a theorist of rationality, as a theorist of modernity, as a theorist of state power in your other work. Now, when it comes to these two lectures, the science as vocation and the politics as vocation lectures, one of the things that for me were really quite interesting, going back to the historical setting or the historical context in which they are set, and the way that that context can or cannot or might speak to the present time, is realizing, which I must admit I had completely forgotten or had completely slipped my mind, that politics as vocation was actually exactly 100 years old at the point at which you gave these two as banner lectures on values in 2019. So, and obviously science as vocation is a bit older. So science as vocation hails from the same year as the Russian Revolution, as you've just said. So it is actually very interesting to reflect on how these two particular historical moments, obviously one is the Russian Revolution, the other is, and the already sort of close to the end of World War I. The other is both after the aftermath of World War I, but also clearly, I would say, sort of not only nascent, but at that point already relatively developed drive towards that will eventually culminate in the victory of National Socialism in Germany. How these two contexts, and especially this seemingly very productive period for Weber, speak to our present day predicament. So on that point, I was going to ask you if you don't mind elaborating a bit, in particular, what elements of what you refer to as nihilism, both in knowledge production and in politics, that Weber identifies, you found useful for thinking with or thinking through the present times. And I'm thinking in particular about the fact that 2019 is obviously the year before the pandemic hit. So in many ways, obviously, some of the reactionary political tendencies were already there, were very much well in place. But then on the other hand, we also saw quite a, sort of a degree of independent political developments that in some ways amplified the existing tendencies, but in some ways also challenged him. So to speak, I would ask you to think about, or to think with Weber, post-Weber, but also post the 100th anniversary of both lectures. So how far can Weber take us today?
So once again, I have to begin a little bit behind your question, just to clarify for those less familiar with Weber or traditions of thinking about nihilism, that our contemporary associations with nihilism, popular associations, which tend to take nihilism in the direction of ennui or boredom or punk or fatalism or a sense of utter meaninglessness in the world, is not what Weber is doing with nihilism and not what I'm doing with nihilism. So if I can just take a minute to say what each of us are doing, Weber is drawing from Nietzsche's account without replicating it precisely. He's also deeply influenced by Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, by the Russian tradition. And the fundamental meaning of it for him has to do with what has happened in modernity as monotheism has clashed, as it were, with the rise of science and the rise of the Enlightenment to divide truth from religious authority and to challenge religious authority as a source of either knowledge or value. And that doesn't mean for Weber that religion has disappeared. And it doesn't mean for him that values have disappeared. So he is not of the punk tradition of nihilism, but rather for him, the problem is that values have proliferated, that they have as a result also cheapened, lost some of their foundational status, lost all of their foundational status in nature and in God, and instead delivered to us the very difficult fact that human beings are the producers of value, that value is something human-made, and that value is something that has no tether in absolute authority. Now, for Weber, that does not mean that we give up on value, quite the contrary. He thinks that makes it all the more important. But it does mean for him that it doesn't belong in the realm of fact, and in fact has to be pulled apart from facticity to be that which we struggle over in the ethical and the political realm. And, that's really the fundamental shot over the bow of these two lectures and of Weber's late thinking more generally. The claim is that once value is detached from divine authority, what we have is science on the one hand that tells us how things work and what things consist of, but doesn't tell us what they mean or how to value them. And what we have on the other hand is value that tells us, that has to do with how we value things or what we think things mean, but isn't settled. Rather, we struggle over it. And for him, that's the essence of politics, that's struggling over values. Now, why do I think this matters to us today? Because what Weber understands is that refusal to accept the description I've just given of the coming apart of fact and value and truth, and instead understanding that facts are delivered by science without meaning and values do not adhere to an absolute truth, but rather are what we would say today contingent, not relative, but contingent. And for Weber are the ultimate meaning in human life. For us to refuse to accept that is for him the condition of nihilism. The condition of nihilism that he thinks is ubiquitous in his age is in, for example, the deep politicization of the classroom or knowledge, the expectation that knowledge will deliver meaning, or that the professor will be, as it were, a preacher or a demagogic leader rather than simply an inculcator of knowledge. Now, I don't subscribe to the fact-value distinction that Weber gives us. That should be obvious. But I do subscribe to the interval that he's trying to articulate. And I think the reason his work has so much produces so much illumination for our present is that he's diagnosing both a condition in the classroom of a hyper-politicized knowledge domain that is doing nobody any good, and is diagnosing a condition in politics of a kind of hyper-politicization, not of ultimate values, but as it were of all kinds of incidental things. So, today everything is political, everything is branded with a value, but in a sense that cheapens it. It keeps us from focusing on what the ultimate stakes in value struggles really are. So that's why I've turned to him, but also why I think he, how shall I put it, sheds illumination without being the new voice or theorist for our time. I think we can adapt from him, adopt from him, struggle with him, wrestle with him, because he's wrestling with something that is also our problem, but comes out in a different place than many of us would want to come out.
I think you've raised something really, really important there, which is that as other, I would say, theorists of separation or theorists of boundary crossing, Weber is someone who's really useful for thinking with, or really good for thinking with. And in particular, this separation between knowledge and politics is something that I want us to get sort of into in more detail in a minute. But before that, one thing that I kept thinking about as I was both reading your book as well as reflecting on my own engagement with Weber, which obviously came in part through my sort of generic classical training, but in part then came from reading, in particular, Boltanski and Chiapello's New Spirit of Capitalism, which tries to repeat the movement that Weber will famously perform with the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, which is sort of identifying, so to speak, the ideological or belief-based sources of capitalist accumulation and so on and so forth. They repeat it for the present time. One thing I kept thinking about is, in fact, the particular context in the classroom in which I do use these two lectures, and that's giving my students an excerpt from Science as Vocation, which obviously with the infamous or famous quote, "Science cannot give you an answer to what is a good life." And in philosophy, and this brings me to the question of boundaries, we in fact, although we often do not consider ourselves science, at least, certainly not in the way in which I think Weber would have espoused the sort of the value of Wissenschaft. But on the other hand, we do like to think that we can give an answer, or at least that we're trying to find an answer to the question of what is a good life. I think this highlights something really important, which is that the boundary between knowledge and politics, the analytical, diagnostic, etc., and the normative and political are something that we all, in fact, cross quite regularly. So in that sense, one of the things that I'm particularly interested in when it comes to Weber is precisely what elements of the two did he see as, so to speak, sort of negative or polluting, because in some ways, obviously, he understood that both have a lot in common, in part, in particular, in the way in which they were used at that particular point in time, and still, as you've just said, to ground authority. So I'm wondering, especially for people who are not super familiar with either or both of the lectures, whether you just want to give like a very, very short summary or a comment on what it is in particular within science, or, you know, as you've said already, within the role of academic authority or authority within universities in the classroom, and on the other hand, within politics, within the role of the politician, because I think it's also really interesting to know that Weber, in fact, has a slightly different framing of the role of the individual versus the role of the institution in these two contexts. So what is it about each and either that he finds so harmful, and why?
You know, there are very large answers to that question, but in some ways, the heart of the matter for him is the spirit of each. And by spirit, I mean that for him, to know something, to really know something, one has to have a certain dispassionate character. That doesn't mean that passion cannot animate the curiosity, but then to know it, one has to become relatively constrained and restrained as a human in his understanding, and foreground a certain analytic and fact-finding facility in us that allows us to know rather than to impute value, meaning, desire of our own onto the object. Now I'm exaggerating a bit, but I want to say for him, politics is nothing but this realm in which one struggles for what one most passionately wants the world to become. It is the domain in which you only belong there if you have not just an appetite for power, but an appetite or a desire to make the world in the image of the values that you think ought to organize it. And that's why leadership is so important to him, because the charismatic leader is that creature who has that vision and has the ability to compel a following. And I would say you could go sideways and make that charismatic leadership not simply into a figure, an individual figure, but even a movement or something else. But he calls it a cause. One has to have a cause. And in the domain of knowledge, one actually has to be, as it were, a little bit quiet, a little bit willing to sit with and know and study, and above all, take apart the problem that is before you. And even when one is studying values, and Weber thinks you don't just study facts in the knowledge domain, you also study values. But even when you're studying values, you do it by analyzing them, by thinking about their premises, their implications, their entailments. He's very clear in the lectures that the best thing we can do when students bring their values into the classroom is say, okay, that's your passionate attachment. Now let's see what it means. Let's see what it rests on. Let's see what its assumptions are. Let's see what its implications are. Let's see what it would mean to bring that into realization, and who would suffer, who would die, who would live, who would prosper. And the who here today could include everything from human life to non-human life. In politics, you cannot ask that question. You're struggling to make your cause prevail. In politics, you don't sit and deliberate and analyze and deconstruct the meaning of the value that you're pursuing. You don't take it all apart and look at it from every angle. You struggle to make it a winning cause. And the reason I've gone to this distinction in spirit to answer your question is that I think we have, I think if there's one major boundary breakdown today that signifies the nihilism that Weber was trying to push us through by redrawing some lines and by insisting on an ethical orientation toward each, it is this. It is the boundary breakdown between the spirit of each, where the expectation is that the knowledge domain is where you're slugging it out for your values, and the expectation is that the domain of politics is the place where you could go and make all the deconstructive, analytic, deliberative techniques that you've learned in the classroom play out. And here I want to switch very quickly from Weber to Stuart Hall. I end the book by bringing Stuart Hall to Weber to make a kind of strange breed. It's Hall who said, look, theory is about making meaning slide. It's about a deconstructive process, whether one's engaged in psychoanalytic or analytic or continental or post-structuralist or other kinds of theory. It's about making meaning slide. Politics is about arresting that signification of that slide of signification. It's about making the meaning you want hegemonic. It's about taking a term, whether it's gender or freedom or equality or reparations, and not taking it apart endlessly, but making it prevail. But you take those same terms into the classroom or into the research domain, and you have to take them apart. Otherwise, your research and your teaching is not worth a thing.
I think that's a great point. I think it says a lot about why, sort of Weber is not just a reference in sort of the history book or history of social sciences and or social theory, or is in fact very, very useful for thinking things through today. I think that has to do precisely because of this movement of trying to, and I think you used the same expression at one point, which is trying to police the boundary, in part in order to demonstrate that the two are never separate. I was going to say one of the things that I in particular found really poignant as an illustration in your book of exactly how the two can become intertwined or become elided precisely by claims that, and this is something that's also very sort of close to my own work and the position I've taken, which is not to mistake theoretical or knowledge-based interventions for political interventions, because I think all too often, and there is obviously comfort with that, we tend to think that because we've said something in the classroom, that has exactly the same status as, I don't know, saying it in an occupation or in parliament or whatever it is. But I want to come to bring something, or to bring that kind of distinction to bear in something else. And if you don't mind, I am going to quote directly from your book, in part because I think you pinpoint something that's really, really important there and is very much a topic of thinking and discussion today, which is that you say, so speaking about Weber's sort of approach to distinguishing between the kind of authority associated with the production of knowledge and the kind of authority associated with politics. So you say such an approach differs radically from contemporary bids for teachers to balance political views with opposing ones, or to let them compete with one another for attractiveness, or to crown some political value systems as moral or correct, while denouncing others as evil or wrong. These approaches leave values unexamined, implicitly rendering them beyond the ken of the classroom, either because they're sacred and hence untouchable, or because they're mere opinion and hence unimportant, or because they're subjective and hence unscientific. Each turns them into objects of deference or derision rather than of beady-eyed analysis. And I think in many ways, Weber's approach can be seen as, with this romanticization of beady-eyed analysis, can in some ways be seen obviously as passé. But then on the other hand, I think it is particular these kinds of contexts where it really brings back the message that, in fact, we have never been really good at distinguishing the two. And the fact that we're no longer even expected to do that, even if performatively, is in fact not only contributing to different kinds of nihilism in the social and political domain, but is also just making us not very good at understanding values and where they come from.
So that's really important. I think, for Weber, the reason he rejected all of those approaches to treating values in the classroom, the marketplace of ideas, which he thought was just, just degraded them further, because it just treated them as if they needed to compete and whichever one won. But he knew that was not how values work, or it did not treat them. It did not cast them as having the seriousness, the life guiding qualities that they needed to have, or the idea of balance that we have today. If you're going to tell the left-wing story, tell the right-wing story. And for him, that too doesn't take them apart. And above all, one of the expressions of nihilism for him was the idea that even while values had lost their authoritative grounding or source, we tend to treat them as if they're untouchable, as if they can't be analyzed, as if they can't be scrutinized. And I think to this day, there is a quality that not only students, but many teachers bring to values. When a student expresses a deep religious conviction in a classroom, we often kind of just go quiet and say, okay, that's your view, rather than examining it. When students express strong political views on any end of the spectrum, we just treat them as if, okay, that's your view. And Weber certainly was in accord with the idea that values emanate from what he called, or what I'll call passionate attachments, that they didn't come from rational deliberation, to return to your earlier point about philosophy. They weren't arrived at deductively or inductively, analytically, or any other way. They emerge from within the subjective domain, but he didn't think they were therefore untouchable or uneducable. And for him, if the classroom had a value in dealing with values, it was precisely that they should be touched and educated, not denied and not brokered, but rather turned into objects of scrutiny. Now, what the limitation of that is, of course, in a Weberian frame, is that risks their rationalization, their disenchantment. It risks taking a process further that he worried about endlessly in terms of evacuating the world of meaning. You know, it could lead to a, well, if any value can be taken apart and scrutinized, then all values end up on the dust heap of analysis and scrutiny. His cure for that was to teach students that nothing was more important than having values. Nothing was more important than deciding what life means. And that's why he kept going back to that Tolstoy quote, that science can't do that for us, that the teacher can't do that for us, that others can't do that for us. Now, of course, this ends up being a very individualist teaching. You know, you have to decide what life means. But again, I think we can take it, rework it a bit, and say, yeah, for us as teachers, and perhaps for us engaging in politics, that encomium to say that nothing is more important than deciding what life means and what we value. It doesn't have to just be an I question. It can be a we question. It can be a coalitional question. It can be a question that we understand as being at the very center of democratic repair, of re-democratizing our societies. What does life mean? Not what does the market say, not what do the technocrats say, not what do the religionists tell us it must mean, but what do we think collective life together in the 21st century, in our current conditions, predicaments, and challenges, what do we think it should be about? And that's, you know, that's the post-nihilist challenge, is understanding that that is something we arrive at, not something we discover.
I wholeheartedly agree. And I think in that sense, Weber obviously prefigures in some ways a lot of the theorists who will come later, including Hannah Arendt, but he also builds on an older tradition, in part exactly in existentialist philosophy, that will then also go on to, so from Kierkegaard to, and I'm leaving currently the Russian tradition of that aside. So, but the Western European ones are going from Kierkegaard and then on to French existentialists. So one of the things that I really found interesting about these two lectures in particular is what he says is, or obviously the way that you engage with what he says, as far as it concerns authority. So in particular, how this sort of fake separation or the evacuation of foundation to values can in fact, both within the academic and the political domain, lead to the sort of positioning or success of individuals who will in some ways promise to replace whatever has been lost. And what's quite interesting for me there is that, in fact, he takes, again, opposing or very different approaches to how useful or tolerable or excusable this is on the one hand in the classroom, and then on the other hand within politics or within political institutions or political competition. And I think this also has to do something with the different approaches to what is the relationship with others and the relationship to power within the classroom. He doesn't say, I mean, he doesn't say that in contemporary terms in which we would, but I think at least also kind of basing it on your reading, Weber very much recognizes that the classroom is a particular power setting. And in that sense, I think one of the things that clearly come out from his analysis of in science as vocation is exactly the fact that he's worried about the fact that academics, professors, and again, going back to your initial remark about the particular historical and institutional and political setting in which he is giving science as vocation as a lecture, which is 1917. That means something in particular within German academia, where professors do have this kind of stardom status. That they will, in fact, use the opportunity to basically position themselves as new or, false prophets. But then, on the other hand, within politics, he, in fact, by endorsing charismatic authority, says that under certain conditions, and again, within the possibility of exercising a certain kind of restraint, this is, in fact, exactly what politicians should do. And I was going to ask you to elaborate a bit on something that I thought was another brilliant point, which is how the left, broadly speaking, but obviously in particular in the US, I think with one exception, in the UK, has also been really, really bad at accommodating or using strategically charismatic authority. So it has also led, in a manner of speaking, to obviously all kinds of charismatic authority within politics being almost gratuitously left to the right.
Yes. Okay, briefly, I do think we need to mark the fact that Weber's insistence on suspending personality and politics in the classroom is not simply to comport with his view of that knowledge has to be dispassionate, but also has to do with an elite constituency for that education. Presumably, students are capable of undertaking, students in that period of German higher education, a very select group of people, he presumes are capable of undertaking the kind of analytic work that he's insisting they should be doing with both knowledge, facts, and values. But the same he would not argue for mass politics. And of course, Weber's own view of democracy is pretty bleak or thin. He thinks the best you can do is plebiscitary democracy, leadership democracy. He doesn't really believe in the real deal. And that has to do with the universal franchise, et cetera. So I think we need to mark that as part of what's creating this big difference. But the question with which you ended, yeah, I don't want to go too far with this point, but I do think it's really significant that, as you say, we have mostly left charismatic leadership to the right, where it's almost always denounced by centrists and the left as demagogic and populist, if not authoritarian. It's almost always put in that bucket. And then we imagine that we are what? Not engaged at all by charisma, when in fact, secretly, we often are. In the United States, I would say, being enamored way back when with Obama at the beginning, before he got in office. We know charisma drains as soon as you're in office, unless you don't take the office seriously, which was true of Trump and your guy as well. But I think that if you take Obama, or you take AOC, or you take excitement about other lefty political leaders who appear to be very charismatic, there is often some excitement about it, and then some argument about whether we should be excited about it or whether we should see through to, you know, but look, here's the point. As you say, if we are to become capable of both winning larger and larger populations to electoral favor and capable of mobilizing those populations for values other than the conservative ones that and the reactionary ones that the right has been so successful in doing, it's not going to happen through technical, rational explanations of policy positions. It's just not. That's not possible in this time. It's not possible through social media. It's not possible in politics more generally. And I think that the continued commitment to that kind of political thinking, or to campaigns that are then kind of mildly based on it at a campaign level, where it's all about targeting in issue-specific ways particular populations that presumably already have formed interests on things, it doesn't actually bring what we've been talking about, care for who we are, what we should do, and where we should go, to the heart of left politics, except in the extreme left mobilizations, where it takes the form usually of you know, angry and anguished cries, but those don't tend to win over the mainstream. So at our peril, we avoid things like charismatic leadership and serious value promulgation at the heart of our political life. As you say, it's not just a question of whether, you know, we're centering values, it's a question of being strategic. And you're the one who put it that way, you know, and Weber wasn't concerned with that, but we should be concerned with that.
I absolutely agree. And I think it's really something to bear in mind, especially because of what you, I think, not only correctly, which should almost go without saying, but brilliantly identify as the left's tendency, or at least the mainstream left, the dominant left's tendency to withdraw into rational legal kinds of authority, or to seek to found or to establish its own authority, at least by recourse to rational legal kinds of authority. And in the UK, where I've just or they flew from yesterday, we are in fact in the process of seeing exactly this kind of process, whereas someone who was a charismatic leader of the left is being in sort of having to challenge or fight back against being deselected, and someone whose position is very much predicated on a very, very, I would say, dry form of rational legal authority is leading on this. That said, we are sort of beginning to inch towards the end of our time. We have a lot of really good questions, but before we close, I want to ask the last question that speaks to authority, or perhaps speaks against authority, so to speak. And that's about the charismatic authority of theory. One of the things that, you know, as I said at the beginning, I really valued about the book is that you really demonstrate that it is possible to think with theorists, or the theory should be about thinking with, so that the sort of connection between relevance and reference need not descend into reverence necessarily. And I think your relationship to Weber is very much one that demonstrates that there is still something to be said about contemporary relevance for and of Weber, despite the fact that he is and has been a pretty consistent reference in social theory throughout, I would say, the 20th century and then beyond. So I would ask you on this last note, how would you translate these insights into thinking about what it means to think with someone, or what it means to think against someone, so to speak?
It's a beautiful question, and I don't have a beautiful answer. I can only say that for me, the better the thinker I'm thinking with, the better my thinking. And that means not choosing who we think with according to whether we agree with them or we think our values and their values more or less are aligned. For me, it's why thinking with Nietzsche is as important as thinking with Marx. It's why thinking today with a range of, I'm not talking about pundits. I'm talking about big thinkers, deep thinkers, people who diagnose our world or have diagnosed their world powerfully. And I put Weber in that camp, as a thinker who had a very powerful diagnosis of his world, even if it was animated ultimately by conservative convictions and ambitions politically and social scientifically. And so I guess the place I would land, so that we have a little room to answer one or two questions from the viewers or audience or whatever we call ourselves now on webinars. The place where I would land is that we mustn't be afraid to think with somebody, especially the dead. They're dead. They're not going to get us. They're not going to dominate us. There's the risk of seduction. And I think that risk of seduction is an important one to take and to be wary of. One learns that from Socrates, from Nietzsche. We have all learned it from thinkers we have been seduced by over the years and then had to surface from. And even in this book, I was aware in writing it that at times I found myself too pulled into Weber's formulations of things and had to pull myself back. Like, I don't believe in the fact-value distinction. I know better. We know that facticity is politically constructed. We know that values aren't just hanging there, as principles, that they're materially and historically formed, that they have all kinds of determinants and drives besides the subjective desires or attachments of individuals. So seduction's a risk, but absolute domination is not. And so in my teaching and in my thinking and in that, I think others of us might want to entertain. I think it's important to spend time with thinkers with whom one can think and learn and resist, and in resisting, perhaps arrive at some other places. I do not believe in the toolbox theory, the idea that you just think what you like from people. I really believe in the immersion, the going under, as Nietzsche put it, theory of working with a theorist. Just give over and see what happens when you inhabit that world. And I don't know. I know that this is controversial. There are a lot of people who say, "Oh, you work on Schmidt, that Nazi," and yeah, that's right. But he's not going to get me.
I think that's a great point, and perhaps one that really speaks to yet another context in which knowledge and politics are in fact very different. So working with Schmidt does not mean becoming a Schmidt.
No, and I would not have dinner with him.
Yeah, exactly.
Not just that I wouldn't do politics with him. I understand a mortal political enemy, but that doesn't mean that there isn't something to think with there. And I don't just mean think with because you learn something about the opposition. I mean think with. He taught us something about the political that I think we can extract. Yeah. Okay. Do we have any time for any questions?
We do. And I was going to say, I was counting on perhaps extending a bit, because if Anthony says it's okay, in part because we started a bit late. So I'm just going to launch into questions, and then hopefully Anthony can let us know if it's okay to overrun a bit. So I'll start with Alice's question, who's thanking you for this awesome talk, and says, I see that the blurb for your book contains the question, what has happened to truth with capital T? Given the many cogent critiques of what we can aspire to in the realm of truth, what do you think we should aspire to?
Well, I think we have to break truth open into its many meanings. And just very briefly, I would say that, truth with a capital T, the idea that there is a true view of the world, that we give up. The idea that there is one true set of values or morality, that we give up. But the idea that there are governing truths and that there are organizing truths, and that we are aspiring to knowledge in both the political and the academic realm that is accountable, that is where we can keep asking questions of, as it were, a settled axiom or fact, and see what happens to it when we keep approaching it and reapproaching it. That's accountable knowledge, knowledge that can give an account of itself and that can withstand accounting. All of those things, I think, leave truth intact. This, I think, does not make truth relativist at all, but rather forces us to surrender the idea that we are searching for the truth or the absolute truth, either in the moral or in the scientific or social scientific realm.
That's brilliant. And I think it also answers Ken's question, who asked if you could say a bit more about the distinction between the values being contingent but not relative. I think this is actually a really good way of addressing it. Are you okay if we go for another 5 minutes and just take some other questions? Because especially towards the end, there is a lot and they're quite good. So I would like to address at least some. So Jilly is asking, given the prescience of Stuart Hall's thought mentioned by you, what might the domain of popular culture and the media play in this breakdown? Or I would say, what role would the domain of popular culture and the media play in this breakdown of boundaries and tendency towards nihilism? Big question.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that the strange combination of siloed yet feral elements of social media, that is, we're all in our own silos. They stay separate from one another, whether it's not only social media, but also we could say, this is true kind of across the board of all forms of media today. Everybody's attached to a different silo, but it's also unaccountable, increasingly unaccountable. And I don't just mean deregulated, I mean unaccountable. It's domains of media that where we are not constantly able to say, well, what does this mean? And what is the evidence? Or what if we looked at it this way? Or what if we approached with a different interpretive frame? How would this so-called truth shift or wobble or collapse? Because social media is so not organized that way, and media more generally is not, there's no doubt that it is contributing to the problem. That said, I also want to suggest that too often we blame the media as if it broke truth. And before that, maybe it was postmodernism. And I just think both are very funny because they attribute a power, especially in the case of postmodernism, whatever that was, to produce a condition in the world that is much bigger than either one. So with social media in particular, and media more generally, I would say it has intensified a problem, it's ramified a problem, but it didn't create the problem.
I think it's really interesting that both postmodernism and sort of media studies actually tend to overlap in the same academic departments, or at least used to, including the School for Cultural Studies that Hall used to belong to. So there has to be something about that, as a matter of fact. I'm going to combine two questions from Corey and Flavia because I think they address the same thing and they're equally important. And I would say Corey is asking, how should we set this discourse in the context of matters and values that are at the center of liberation and emancipatory struggles? Or more specifically, how should we understand the decisions made by the AP College Board to withdraw from the syllabus concepts and ideas that have been central to liberatory knowledges for marginalized communities? And Flavia is asking, saying that they agree on the importance of scrutinizing values and engaging in collective discussions about them. However, how do we deal with conflicting sets of values established at opposite poles of the ideological and political spectrum, particularly in the context of an agonistic democracy? So I would say these two questions for me both speak to the question of, or the necessity to sometimes make decisions in terms of what is it that we actually engage with / include, whether it's syllabi or whether it is within the political domain, and what we exclude, and on the basis of what, which is even more interesting.
So I'm going to repeat myself a little. Once again, I think political polarization is more an expression of nihilism than a cause of it. And yet I think many people tend to see political polarization as having caused all kinds of breakdowns in truth and in the possibility and in democracy. But I want to suggest that the phenomenon of political polarization is very much itself a certain expression of the conviction that there are really, truly true values. And it's a resistance to this idea that we create them, that we have to fight for them to prevail because we believe in them, but not simply because they are right and true. Now, what to do about the effort to destroy that struggle that many people feel the right wing is engaging in today? For example, in the case of attempting to expunge certain materials from schools, or don't say gay, or attacks on trans healthcare and provisioning or protection of minors, or 100 other ways in which the right seems to be absolutely uncommitted to democratic contestation and instead is exercising authoritarian approaches to everything from instrumentalizing political processes like rights for undemocratic purposes to engaging in these forms of censorship and control. I think those things need to be named as for what they are. I think the place to have the battles about them is, again, very much in the schools. I think it's in the educational domain. That is the place where it has to be fair. It has to be right. And you may have to defend against losing your job to do it. It has to be fair to say, okay, somebody brought this value to us. Let's look at it. Let's see what it means. Let's see what its premises are. Let's see what it thinks its authority is. That's the place where, as it were, citizens become educated, thoughtful, potentially. In the political sphere, it is a battle these days for many things, but let's say the very preservation of any kind of democratic sphere at all against authoritarian efforts to put an end to it. And that has to be articulated as the struggle, but it's not the place where you're going to get thoughtfulness. It's just not. And again, I would say Weber knew that.